For most of my childhood, I lived without my father in the home. In his absence, I conjured visions of someone superhuman. A man who was as gentle as he was kind and understanding. A man who embodied all that I thought a father should be. I grew up with this projection of a man as my sole paternal figure, and my wild imagination allowed childhood ideations to fill in the blanks that reality left behind. During the summer of my 20th year, this projection was shattered, leaving behind a distasteful reality. Can I truly accept you, flaws and all? Should I accept this reality? Do I have to? The boundaries between family members become hazy as individuals succumb to nostalgia, obligation, and filial piety. Coping with the flaws of your parents is a hallmark in every young person's transition into adulthood. Some choose to ignore these flaws and others address it in their own ways. Regardless, adulthood truly illuminates the flaws of those around you. Wait. Okay. Hey y'all, my name is Yana B, and I like to watch movies in my room while yapping for an extended period of time. Welcome to my channel. Today we're talking about Kasi Lemon's Eve's Bayou. I've been meaning to make this video for the longest, and when I say the longest, I mean the longest. I got busy with graduation, but I'm here, and you're here. Thank you for coming. Beginning with the iconic line, "The summer I killed my father, I was 10 years old," the film Eve's Bayou utilizes the autobiographical memory of our main protagonist, Eve Baptiste, to explore themes such as boundaries, anger, the perspective of children, sibling relationships, and the understanding of a child. Staging the death of a parent through the recollection of a child, this film illustrates that memories are dynamic entities that shape our perception of those around us, as well as our personal identity. The 80s and 90s era of African American media gave rise to TV shows that portrayed the lives of well-to-do Black families or Black excellence. In particular, family sitcoms such as Family Matters, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, The Cosby Show are examples. These portrayals of Black excellence typically centered families that conform to both gender and class ideals within society. And while none of these shows are bad, per se, their surface level portrayals of race, gender, and class is both worthy of note and critique. FB Signifier briefly expounds upon the connection between 80s/90s Black media and the history of gender/class ideals in the African American community in one of his most recent video essays, currently titled Derek Jackson, The Gender Wars in You. In conjunction with this, the 90s also inducted a class of filmmakers that dramatically changed the scope of Black representation. These filmmakers contributed to a movement that was anticipated to dramatically impact the landscape of Hollywood, which privileged both white stories and directors. Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing demonstrated the impact of gentrification, racial bias, bigotry, and police brutality in Bed-Stuy. John Singleton's Boys in the Hood was a coming-of-age film centering 3 Black men growing up in Crenshaw. Mario Van Peebles' New Jack City followed a drug lord and an undercover cop during the 1980s New York City crack epidemic. Leah Dash's Daughters of the Dust detailed the migration of 3 generations of Gullah Geechee women, and Kasi Lemon's Eve's Bayou centered the coming of age of a 10-year-old Black girl in the 1960s. Similarly to the trend of 90s Black sitcoms at the time, Eve's Bayou centered a wealthy Black family that adhered to rather traditional forms of gender and class ideals. The intriguing dynamic of a wealthy Black family in the South is what initially drew both producers and audiences to the film. Lemon's portrayal of the beauty of Black Southern luxury provided both representation to familiar Black audiences and novelty to investors. From parties to dresses to pearls, the luxurious aesthetic of Eve's Bayou juxtaposed the contemporary portrayals of the Black South, which typically centered hardships and enslavement, Jim Crow, and or some type of racial violence. There were no white extras or main characters for that matter. Within the community of Eve's Bayou, Lemons was able to portray various aspects of Blackness, which extended beyond skin color or race, including various community conflicts that did not involve white people. This focus on the challenges within Black family dynamics was purposeful on the part of director and screenwriter Kasi Lemons. And when asked about the absence of direct references to racism within the film, despite it taking place during the 1960s in Louisiana, Lemons states, And the more meetings I took with people that said, why can't you have one white character? The more militant I got about the vision. And so, there are no white extras in Eve's Bayou. There are no white people in Eve's Bayou. Because we African Americans have complicated lives, and difficult lives, and complex relationships, and complex family relationships that have nothing to do with white people. There are families that are just struggling to be a family, you know. And there are husbands and wives dealing with all kinds of issues. The Baptistes exemplify the realities of a black family that has achieved both class and gender idealizations of black excellence. And yet, despite the success, the Baptiste family is rapidly falling apart. What stood out to me in this film was women's portrayal of how gender dynamics play into family dysfunction. The patriarchal values that the Baptiste family abides by negatively impacts nearly every member of the family. This is first demonstrated by the way that love is expressed and understood between family members. When Eve asks her father if he loves her mother, this is how he responds. Your mama is the most perfect, beautiful woman I've ever met. Your mama is a lady, and I will always love her. Understand? Always. Despite Luis's continued affairs, he validates Roz's position as the most beautiful and perfect woman he's ever met. By following up this judgment with the statement, Roz is a lady and I will always love her, Luis distinguishes the behavior that he values in a wife from the behavior that he values in a woman he's simply having an affair with. Later in the film, Luis doubles down on this answer when speaking to his oldest daughter, Cicely. Do you still love her? Darling, let me tell you something. When I met your mother, men fought each other for the privilege of speaking her name. She was so pretty, it was painful to look at her. And she could dance almost as good as you. In both of these instances, Luis asserts that it's Ross's ability to perform traditional femininity that qualifies her for her husband's love. Teen adherence to gender expectation and norms as a qualifier of love is a common theme throughout the film. Ross herself admits to wanting to marry Luis due to his ability to take care of her. Moselle was only able to recognize the extent of her second husband's love after he utilized physical force against her lover. And throughout the film, it's clear that the pedestal that Luis is placed upon is due to his occupational achievement. At the end of the day, the motivations behind Roz's and Luis's decision to marry each other was based upon gendered expectations of what women and men bring to relationships. The family's reaction to Luis's infidelity is an example of how gender is used as a barometer of what acceptable behavior is like between men and women. The sexual fidelity of husbands has been socially undervalued when compared to the social fidelity of women. This impacts marital relationships because it sets the social precedent for the standards to which wives and husbands are typically held to. When discussing 19th century adultery cases, Associate Professor of European Studies Josephine Hergertz states, gender conceptions of fidelity and desire, on the one hand, tie together different forms of masculinity, and on the other, enlarge the divide between male and female married identity. Roz's position as a worthy wife is predicated upon her sexual behavior, performance of femininity, and appearance. After Eve divulges to Cicely what she saw in the carriage house between Luis and Maddie Martin, Cicely first denies this accusation by comparing her mother to Maddie Martin, stating, "Come on, Eve, Daddy wouldn't touch that cow. I'm certain. I mean, what would Daddy want with Maddie Martin? Mama's the most beautiful woman in the world." Through her comparison, Cicely positions her mother as a better woman than Maddie Martin due to her chastity as well as her appearance. Regardless of one's opinion on how forgivable the act of adultery is, the betrayal of adultery is undeniably traumatizing, whether it was enacted by a man or a woman. How we react to adultery societally does not illuminate this fact, but rather enforces gendered standards of propriety within marriages. Adultery was a central conflict in the film, and it really strained the relationship between Luis and Roz. However, at no point of the movie did any of the adults of the film bring up the notion of divorce. The importance of the history of divorce law to the story of Eve's Bayou is demonstrated by what divorce law illustrates about societal perceptions of both marital relationships as well as marital identities between wives and husbands. Prior to the 1960s, divorce laws were based on fault meaning the petitioning party had to prove that their spouse was at fault in some way, shape, or form in order to be granted a divorce. These divorces were granted both sparingly and on a strict criteria. In fact, many believed that it was against public interest to even encourage divorce. Under these legal standards, divorces was both rare and only granted by judges under extenuating circumstances. Adultery was one of these circumstances in which a divorce might be granted. However, traditionally, the extramarital affairs of married men was judged far less harshly, both legally and socially. From the early colonial era to the 19th, 20th century, adultery could only be charged under criminal law if the affair involved a married woman. On the other hand, the affairs between married men and single women could only be charged as fornication charges, which was significantly less harsh in comparison. Transitioning into the 19th century, society began to note the detrimental effects that criminally charging women with adultery had, so there was significantly less criminal prosecutions. This, however, did not negate the gender biases that was present within divorce court. In divorce law, technically, adultery is defined the same between men and women. However, women were far less likely to charge their husbands with adultery. This was due to economic dependence, insufficient legal precedent, as well as social stigma. No-fault divorces became nearly universalized following the 1970s, with California being the first state to fully legalize it in 1969 under Governor Ronald Reagan.
Despite the near universalization of no-fault divorces, gendered reactions to the affairs of men versus reactions to the affairs of women persist. This is especially demonstrated within Eve's Bayou by how the community views Louise versus how they view Maddie Monroe. From the opening scene, insinuations about Maddie Monroe's promiscuity are made. While within the same scene, Louise is hailed for his accomplishments as a colored doctor. His mother also points out how Louise is perceived by the community as being the quote-unquote second coming of Christ. It is evident by these descriptions that despite Louise and Maddie's mutual engagement in an extramarital affair, this does not result in them receiving the same level of social stigma for said actions.
Here we are, an entirely different thing. You're in the bayou country of Louisiana, and you're playing this doctor who cheats on his wife. Bad boy.
But he still loves him.
Well,
He cares about his
whoop-de do.
Come on, everybody has their own little kind of foibles. And I mean, this is a small town doctor who kind of feeds his ego and validates his existence with these small affairs.
Yes, and
like that makes it okay. Yeah, okay.
No, it is understandable. I'm being a little facetious with Sam.
In contrast, it is clear that Louise's fidelity to Ross and the Batiste family is due to his ability to provide. On the surface level, Louise's profession hides his flaws and insecurities. In multiple incidents throughout the film, the actions of Louise is either ignored or justified on the basis of his role as provider of the household. He's working, he must be at work, I have to go to work. Evoking any of these phrases justifies Louise's absence despite the time, date, or location, or even the validity of such a claim.
10-year-old Eve is the first to even verbalize the detrimental effects that Louise's absence is having on her mother, Rosalind. Because of her silence, many seem to ignore or even gloss over the internal turmoil of Rosalind. This can even be said about Ros herself, who downplays her own pain. This is demonstrated in the opening sequence when Louise explicitly dances with Maddie Monroe, and then also in this scene when Ross cuts herself while making a meal. After brushing off her injury by stating, "No, my finger does not hurt too much," Eve calls out the harmful nature of Ross's nonchalance by paralleling her mother's words to that of Mercutio of Romeo and Juliet. There are quite a few references to Shakespearean tragedies throughout Eve's Bayou, and honestly, that topic in itself could be its own video. However, I am not a Shakespearean, nor will I pretend to be for the scope of this video. What you guys do need to know about this scene is Mercutio ends up dying from the wounds that Romeo naively suggests to be not too serious.
There's a moment in the film when Eve even questions this justification of Louise's actions. But after confronting her mother, she is quickly silenced by her Aunt Mazel.
Eve is routinely placed in positions that prompt her to question the logic of the adults around her. And you could say that the excuses that Moselle and Roz provide for Louise's behavior are simply attempts to protect the innocence of 10-year-old Eve. However, witnessing the reoccurrence of said incidents lead me to question, to what extent does the preservation of family secrets involve the silencing of children? And how does said silencing affect children within their adult and adolescent lives?
When reflecting on her decision to marry Louise, Roz highlights his ability to take care of her. When I first met Louise, I watched him set a boy's leg that had fallen out of a tree, and I thought, here's a man that can fix things. He's a healer. He'll take care of me. So I leave my family and move to the swamp, and I find out he's just a man. Beneath Louise's charisma and the grandeur of his position of a black doctor during the 1960s is a sense of personal identity that is incredibly frail. Video essay titled Black Boys Are Cursed by the channel Little Bill utilized the movies Fences and Moonlight to illustrate the fragility of an identity built upon one's ability to perform masculinity. In these examples, performances of masculinity are qualified via one's adherence to heteronormativity and one's ability to provide for a family. In both of these instances, fragility is illustrated by each of these men's inability to measure up to the values and standards that a patriarchal society has set up for them. Louise, on the other hand, is rather successful at performing masculinity to the standards of a 1960s Southern community. He has both a beautiful wife and children, as well as a well-paying and respectable job, and a nice house. And yet he remains internally unfulfilled. Contrary to the movies Moonlight and Fences, it is through his success that Louise illustrates the fragility of basing one's identity on tropes of masculinity. Louise demonstrates his lack of fulfillment and fragile personal identity through his reliance on the external validation through the admiration of women. This weakness is even noted by Louise himself in his letter to Moselle. As you and I know, I am just a small town doctor pushing aspirin to the elderly. But to a certain type of woman, I am a hero. I need to be a hero sometime. That's my weakness. Roz ultimately views her husband as just a man, whereas Louise's insecurities won't allow him to be viewed as anything less than a hero. His insatiable need for external validation and his subsequent indulgence in extramarital affairs results in the degradation of his and Ross's marital relationship. In spite of this, Ross is continuously blamed for the shortcomings of her husband. This tendency informs the core conflict between Ross and Cicely.
Louise is able to rely on his position as provider to dodge any and all accountability for the detrimental effects that his behavior has had on his family. This is also noted by Josephine Hergertz, who details how gender plays into cases of divorce and adultery in her study of adultery and masculinity in 19th century divorce cases.
In discussing the inappropriateness of Cicely's relationship with her father, as well as her anger towards her mother, many tend to either overlook or understate the role that Louise has played in this dynamic. Cicely has been indoctrinated by a value system that privileges the fulfillment of men through the subjugation of the women around them. Louise has formed an emotionally incestuous relationship with Cicely. And even though the physical boundaries that this relationship has crossed is unconfirmed even by the screenwriter Cassie Lemons, it is clear that Louise revels in the at least emotional exploitation of his most beloved daughter. Many chalk up the actions of Cicely as an expression of mere jealousy or anger towards her mother, but to me it reads more so like someone who has a severely insecure attachment style. Louise relies on Cicely for an unhealthy amount of psychological and emotional support. Cicely's adultification corresponds with the assumption that it's her duty to take up the role as surrogate spouse in order to meet the unmet needs of her father and keep her family together. And this development of an insecure attachment style is rather prominent among children of adulterous parents. Generally, they state that infidelity may be a major disruption or shift in an individual's life and can precipitate a change in a child's attachment style, usually with the end result being an insecure attachment style. This may occur because infidelity may diminish the individual's self-esteem and shatter trust and conceptions of intimacy. Following this, Westerman points out that the daughter's trust in boys was severely impacted by the discovery of her father's infidelity, and all of her subsequent relationships were affected. Further, children may no longer hold the same beliefs about the importance of intimate relations or the stability of partnerships. Therefore, seeing a parent's infidelity may lead to a child to develop insecure attachment for a couple of reasons. Anxious attachment may occur due to a desperate need for closeness while maintaining an acute fear of abandonment. For the majority of the film, the fear of abandonment permeates nearly every decision that Cicely makes. As such, it makes sense that it is Cicely's understanding that the cracks in the Batista's household is not due to the philandering ways of the family's patriarch. Her mother's perceived inability to perform her wifely duties then fuels Cicely's resentment towards her. That you don't understand him and you're going to drive him away from us. I'll never forgive you if you drive him away. I went downstairs to make sure he was okay. I was afraid of what she might have said. I was afraid he would divorce us. This quote in particular has been misconstrued by many, stating that it's an expression of jealousy rather than an expression of fear. Instead of acknowledging the trauma that her father has inflicted upon her, Cicely is routinely labeled as a troubled teenager, a brat, or even just plain disrespectful. And while I guess this perception of Cicely isn't untrue if you just judge it based off of the surface level actions that she partakes in throughout the film, these labels hold within them the connotation that there is something intrinsically wrong or troubled about Cicely, rather than the environment around her. This public perception of Cicely's behavior mirrors her own perception of her mother. I believe that the questions that both Eve and Cicely were left with towards the end of the film mirror my own.
How does the idealization of our parents shape us? What does it mean when this bond is either challenged or broken? How does family shape our personal identities, memories, and narratives? And how does one deal with grief in various forms?
Are questions that I believe are common within parent-child dynamics. And granted, this is a very loaded question with a lot of subjectivity and nuance, so obviously my answer does not have to be your own, and nor do I really expect it to be. For me, the loss of innocence or ideological death that corresponds with the inability to completely idolize your parents also coincides with the ability to understand them on a human one-to-one basis. Now, does understanding equate to forgiveness? Absolutely not. However, I do believe it's a step in a mutually beneficial direction. Now, I would like to acknowledge that this review of Eve's Bayou has left quite a bit of analytical material on the table. For one, notably the story's only disabled character was completely written out of the official release of the film. For me, disability plays an additional layer in the understanding of how societal perceptions of gender and performance affects one's success in society. There's also so much to say about the role that memory work plays in both national and personal identity formation. There's also many layers and details that we can go into the history and impact of Black Southern Gothics, such as Eve Bayou. I also didn't even mention Eve, for that matter, the story's main protagonist. However, despite all these shortcomings, I do hope that you enjoyed the video. I might return to some of these topics in the future, but honestly, I do believe that they deserve their own attention and spotlight through their own video. But please comment your thoughts on Eve's Bayou in this review, as well as comment some TV shows or movies that you think I should watch next. This is my first YouTube video, and I can't wait to see what I can do with this channel. But until next time,
now keep in mind
peace.
that I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about my shit.